These least ones you did not do for me, and these will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This is a story told by Anthony de Mello. It was a Jesuit priest from India. And the story is about a holy man, a mystic, who lived long, long ago in a land far, far away. The mystic was back from the desert. Tell us, his followers said, what God is like. But how could he ever tell them what he had experienced in his heart? Can God be put into words? He finally gave them a formula so inaccurate in the hope that some of them might be tempted to experience it for themselves. They seized upon the formula. They made it a sacred text. They imposed it on others as a holy belief. They went to great pains to spread it to foreign lands. Some even gave their lives for it. The mystic was sad. It might have been better if he had said nothing. Well, I thought of this story as I mused about what to say about the feast of Christ the King. What did the authors of our Christian scriptures and those in the early church have to say about the kingship of Jesus? What would Jesus himself have to say? And what do we claim to follow Jesus? What do we claim to say, those of us who follow Jesus in our day and age? Well, as some of you may or may not know, the Feast of Christ the King is a relatively recent feast in our Catholic Church. It was instituted by Pope Pius XI in 1925. The concept of Jesus as King is, of course, earlier than that, and as we can intuit from our readings today. So in 1 Corinthians, we read that the Christ will hand over the kingdom to God and Father. And in Matthew's gospel, we read about the Son of Man sitting on his glorious throne, all references to Jesus as royalty. And even in our day, we honor Christ as King by naming parishes and schools Christ the King. We're not the only ones. The Lutheran, Anglicans, and other Protestant churches also observe this feast. And Christ the King is the subject of many, many books. And you may or may not know that Christ the King shows up on Amazon. You can buy I'm not kidding about this, you can buy Christ the King Welcome Garden Yard Flag. $14.05 and $7.02 for shipping. So that's $21.07, which I think is a real bargain for your own Christ the King yard sign. I wonder what Jesus would say about the church instituting this feast, labeling him a king. You can probably figure out where I'm going with this, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, a few words about kings. Kings, emperors, and other absolute rulers have been around a long, long time, and we all know that. Any student of history knows about the concept called the divine right of kings, which maintains that a king derives his power to rule directly from God, not from his subjects and not from anybody else. And that theory came into being in the 16th century, starting in Scotland and England, and then moving into the rest of Europe. And we know that this concept was roundly repudiated in our Declaration of Independence, where we in the United States maintain that it's we, the people, who are endowed by our Creator, not by a sovereign king, but by our Creator, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So enough of this king stuff, except where Christ is concerned. Him we'll call king, even if we reject his authority and refuse to obey his commands, especially the tough ones like loving others as we love ourselves and even loving our enemies. But let's take a closer look at Jesus. Now, we all know the familiar Bible stories about Jesus' kingship. He's the, quote, Lord of all creation. We read about that in the letter to the Hebrews. And we all know from our Holy Week observances and readings about that back and forth debate that Pilate and Jesus had about whether Jesus was a king or not? Well, the bottom line, or so it seems to me, is that Jesus did not claim the title of king. I guess he let that wait to be bestowed on him by a pope in the 20th century. If a king as absolute ruler is on one end of the continuum, we could say that a slave or a servant, someone with no rights at all, is on the other end of the continuum. We all know from our shameful history of slavery in this country that a slave was a piece of property to be used by his or her owner in any way that he or she saw fit. The slave certainly had no right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Yet, this is the world that Jesus chose for himself. We all know his oft-quoted saying, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." And we all know also from Holy Week readings, Jesus assumed the position of a servant when he did the servant's task of washing his disciples' feet at the Last Supper. Jesus did not seek power over others, and he had some very not nice things to say about those in church and state who did. He was laser focused on the poor, the powerless, and the disenfranchised. He didn't have the time or the interest in self-promotion. And you look how quickly in this brief gospel reading that we just observed how the focus shifts. It starts out with the Son of Man coming in glory and sitting on his glorious throne. Pretty majestic image. And by the way, in our own church, that's filtered down. You know what we call an archbishop? Your Excellency. We don't call him Your Majesty like a king, Your Excellency. And we call a cardinal Your Eminence. And popes used to wear this papal crown. It's like a three-layered thing. Looks like a wedding cake, sort of. Look that up on Google. You'll see some really super interesting images of crowns there. But the bulk of this reading that we heard today is not about the exercise of royal power. It's about serving. It's about doing for others. It's about serving those who had little to no power, serving those who were hungry, had no means to feed themselves or their families, serving those who had no clothes. And the graphic term in the reading is naked. That's the term used, and you got to be pretty poor to be absolutely naked. And serving those who are sick or who are locked away, alone in a prison, any person really who's alone and isolated for any reason. All of these are those who are called the least ones in the parable. And Jesus lauds what he calls the righteous people who tend to the needs of the least ones. It's so obvious and abundantly clear that Jesus preferred being a servant over being a king. Maybe there'll be a pope down the road who will institute the feast of Christ the servant or Christ the slave. So what's the message for us? It's so obvious that I feel a bit ridiculous even talking about it. We are called to serve, not to lord it over, as the saying goes. And the opportunities to serve are limitless. They are limitless because the needs are so great. We don't have to look very far to find the hungry, or the homeless, or the urban or rural poor, the demonized immigrant, the person from a minority community whose rights are denied, the alcoholic or the addict, the mentally ill or the emotionally wounded, the lonely and the isolated, the LGBTQ person who suffers discrimination simply because of who they are, the neglected or abused child, the single parent who's trying to make it day to day on his or her own, the child or adult who suffers needlessly because they don't have access to affordable medical care, the jobless who are living precariously on the edge of hopelessness. I'll stop there, but I encourage each of you, all of us, to continue to build our own list of those with needs. But don't just stop with making a list. Do something. Anything you can. And this is so basic. It's so obvious that once again I feel ridiculous even saying it. If we see something wrong in the way the powerless are treated, we do not just write it down on a list. We do something about it. The civil rights icon, the late Congressman John Lewis, had this to say: if you see something wrong, say something, do something. I believe his words resonate with the words and actions of Jesus when Jesus observed the mistreatment and suffering of the powerless, often because of the self-serving policies of the powerful, the kings, if you will. So I encourage each of you, all of us, to look around at what's wrong, near and afar. What's wrong in our neighborhoods, in our country, in our world, and do something, anything to help improve the lot of the least among us. Jesus saw himself more as a servant than a king. He chose servanthood over kingship. If we wish to follow Jesus, we got to do the same. It's wrong for any of us to abuse or misuse the power that we might have over another person, any person. It's wrong to idly stand on the sidelines when we witness those in power abusing the powerless. We're called to action if we profess to follow Jesus, the Anointed One, Christ, who truly is a king, yet acts very much like a servant.